into play, where they said that anyone interfering with somebody trying to register to vote or with somebody helping them try to register to vote cannot be punished by the state, right? So Mississippi would lock us up, but the feds held the jailhouse key on this issue, right? And so even though we were locked up many times, we never spent long periods of time in jail, right? And the feds handled our cases, right? Because when you come down to it, there were just 3 Black lawyers in the whole state of Mississippi. None of them had passed the bar in Mississippi, and they were strung out, right? So if it hadn't been for the feds and their participation, and here you get into an issue that you guys have to really examine, which is that we have a constitution which forbids certain things. Not a lot, but it does forbid certain things. And it requires certain things. Again, not a lot, but it requires certain things. But in between forbidding and requiring, it permits a whole lot, right? And it's the zone of permission, right, in which all this action takes place. I mean, it's taking place now in the country, right? With the, the back and forth between the executive and the Congress and the courts about, well, what is this zone of permission and who owns it and who should be saying what's permitted and not permitted, right? And so that's a live discussion right now, right? And we saw it in play in Mississippi, and I'll just tell you one story about it. John Hardy was a field secretary for SNCC and was working in Walthall County. And Walthall was one of the 3 counties in Southwest Mississippi, Walthall, Amen, and Pike County. And John was pistol whipped by the registrar when he took some people to register. And he stumbled into the street and the sheriff arrested him for disturbing peace, right? So Burke, who's the assistant attorney general, did an unusual thing that's never been done. I think it was the first and only time it's been done. He stepped into the middle of a criminal state prosecution and said, stop it. Don't have this case. Don't go to trial, right? And he went into the federal courts to stop it. So we are sitting in Judge Cox's chambers, right, in Jackson. John Doe is arguing before Judge Cox, right? Myself, John Hardy, and Jess Brown, his lawyer, 3 of us, right? And it's over, and John Doe comes over and he says, well, Cox denied our motion. I talked to Burke, and Burke wants to appeal it. And so he told me to call Judge Reeves, who is on the 5th Circuit, right, and lives in Montgomery. And I called him, and he said, okay, but bring the state attorney general with you, right? And so they hired a plane. They flew and met with Judge Reeves at midnight, because the next morning, John had to appear in court. Jess Brown, his lawyer, said, no way I'm going down to Tylertown. You guys can go if you want, but not me, right? So John and I go down and sit in the buzzards roofs, right? Get there early, right? The courtroom fills up with white men with their guns. And then the attorney general, the county prosecuting attorney comes in and says, this case has been postponed, right? So we hit it. We got out of there. They came after us like bees. But here you have what's permissible, right? on the Justice Department side, the students that went to Harvard Law School said, oh, you can't do that. That's not permissible. Students that went to Yale Law School said, let's try it, right? And so Burke was of the Yale Law School type, right? So the whole question of what's permissible, right? What can the federal government actually do? What are we willing to actually insist that it does, right? That's on the table.
That's wonderful. But why don't we take one more and then we'll let Bob go to his 4th of July weekend.
All right, next up we have Jonathan Lowenthal.
Hi there, I'm a rising senior at Bullis School in Potomac, and like Ellie said,
I really appreciate you guys coming in. Your words are very moving for me. And as I think Reverend Barber said, the fight for Reconstruction never really ended, but it was just cut short. That being said, as someone who did fight and take a stand against voter suppression during the Civil Rights Movement, do you think that in the present day, as of 2020, there are any key indications or actions currently being taken are very reminiscent of historical voting suppression?
So actions taken by?
Just a key, for example, something I found very reminiscent of historical voting suppression was President Trump saying that voting and that will prevent many people from voting if he sticks with that ideology. And I was just wondering if there's any key indications in the modern day that remind you of something that would have been happening 60 years ago during the Civil Rights Movement.
So you should read Judge Wisdom's decision. Have you ever heard of Judge Wisdom? So he was on the Fifth Circuit. He was appointed by Eisenhower, who was president, Republican. And in Mississippi, Slick put enough pressure on the issue of voting to have the Justice Department rethink its strategy. They didn't tell us they were doing it, but we saw that they did. And what they did was, instead of filing, 50 suits against each registrar, one suit per registrar, wherever they want to decide to file it, they filed a suit against the state. And they did the same in Louisiana. Well, in Louisiana, they won. And there was a 3-judge panel headed by Judge Wisdom from the Fifth Circuit. And in his decision, he basically goes through the history of Louisiana on this issue and notes that after 1875 or 1876, the southern wing of the National Democratic Party became the manifestation of white supremacy. And therefore it had been operating, right? The whole southern wing of the Democratic Party as the manifestation of white supremacy for almost a century, right? So he said, for that reason, we can't have Louisiana decide who is qualified to register to vote. And that was one of the strong arguments that came with the enforcement provision of the Voting Rights Act, which was later struck down by the Roberts Court, right? But the idea that any kind of tinkering with the right to vote at the state level has to be approved at the national level through a federal district court in DC, right? So that kind of state versus feds versus, and in the, so you have the state, you have the court, you have the executive branches, and certainly the Justice Department is acting out of the executive branch, right? And as long as Kennedy is president, they are pushing this. And Kennedy, do you know Burke Marshall's book, Federalism and Civil Rights?
Yeah.
So you guys, the young people, you should read it. It's not big. It's just about this thick, right? And he wrote it in 1964. And if you don't read anything else, read the last few pages, his conclusion, right? Because he summarizes all of this history, right? But what he says in the book is that the president had decided that we were up against a caste system. And he had to do something about the caste system, right? So the idea of a caste system has been out there. Conant, does that name mean anything to you, Jonathan? James Bryan Conant. So he was president of Harvard from 1933 to 1953. And remember, we had the Great Depression, right? So Harvard decided to change the nature of its leadership around this Great Depression and put in Conant, who was a chemistry teacher, not a member of the WASP elite, right? And Conant took one look at what was going on in Harvard and said, this can't be. All these rich white kids up here just doodling around. We need to get kids in here who want to study and learn and be scholars. So he went to look for a test. And he finally settled on the SAT as a way to measure people, should they be given a Harvard National Scholarship. So all the Ivy League schools began to do that, and then World War II happened, and after World War II, Conant set up ETS, right? And then he went, he was ambassador to Germany, overseeing the Marshall Plan. He comes back and he takes a look at American schools in the suburbs and the cities, and he writes a book about it, Slums and Suburbs. And in it, he says that the country has agreed since 1875, 1876, to establish a caste system. What's surprising is that the greatest manifestation of the caste system is its educational system. So he lays it out because no one wanted to hear that. Everybody's talking about integrating schools, right? Which people are not going to do, right? And haven't done, right? And they don't want to deal with the issue of running a caste system, right? So that's what you have to think about in terms of what's going on today. The landscape has changed, right? In effect, and this is a job of your generation, in effect, right, Congress has abdicated its role to actually generate legislation and inform and shape public policy, and handed that off to the courts, right? So all that's being decided at the Supreme Court, and it shouldn't be, right? I mean, Congress should take up its role, right? But it doesn't have, it hasn't put in, we don't have a political party that's willing to take up that role, right? Because it means really organizing at the young people's level all across the country, real organizing work to get different people elected, right? With the idea that they're elected to do a certain job, not just to go up there and take money, you know, from lobbyists, right? So it's that landscape, but you have to really try to take a look at your landscape, right? It's different from the landscape we have.
Well, Bob, this has been the most remarkable odyssey into movement politics and constitutional law and American history and your own amazing biography. I thank you for opening up so many doors intellectually and politically and ethically for the young people to think about. And I know that if we're going to have a new Reconstruction, if we're going to rebuild America and break away finally from this original sin of violent white supremacy, it's going to be because we understand our history, we understand the struggles that have taken place before, and we're willing to dive back in and to learn from the past and to build on the best of it. And you are the best of it. So thank you for everything you've done for our country and everything that you're doing for us today in the Algebra Project and everything that you're going to help us do in the future to rebuild America. Happy 4th of July, my friend.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for having me. Take care.
Good night, everyone.